It starts with a silence, not the peaceful contemplative kind, but the heavy, suffocating silence of a room where a life has just been neatly folded up, cataloged, and dismissed. My name is Sarah, and I'm a biochemist. It's a fact that feels strangely irrelevant in this mahogany-paneled office, surrounded by the scent of old paper and my late father's even older leather armchairs. My brother, Mark, sat across from me, the picture of somber filial duty. He had the handsome, easy face of a salesman, a face that could sell sand in a desert and convince you it was a steal. It was the same face he used on our parents for 35 years, and it had worked like a charm. He couldn't tell a protein from a placebo, but that didn't matter. He had charisma. I had a PhD. In our family, that was never a fair fight. The lawyer, a man named Arthur Abernathy, who had known our family since before I was born, cleared his throat. He avoided my gaze, his eyes fixed on the document in his hands, as if it held the secrets of the universe, and not just the final, codified proof of my lifelong irrelevance. He read through the bequests of property, the charitable donations, the portfolios of stocks and bonds. Then he came to the centerpiece, the culmination of my father's life and my mother's social ambition, Vance Biopharma. To my son, Mark Richard Vance, Mr. Abernathy read, his voice devoid of any emotion, I leave my entire controlling interest in Vance Biopharma, its assets, its patents pending, and its future. He has shown the drive and the vision to carry on the family name. I felt the air leave my lungs in a slow, silent hiss. Mark, ever the performer, managed to look both humbled and magnanimous. He reached a hand across the polished table, a gesture of consolation that felt more like a king patting the head of a court jester. I didn't take it. My own hands were gripping each other in my lap, knuckles white, trying to anchor myself to the cold reality of the moment. I could feel a tremor starting in my fingers. And then came the final twist of the knife, the line that would echo in my head for weeks. Mr. Abernathy adjusted his glasses and read the last sentence concerning the family. As for our daughter Sarah, he mumbled almost as an afterthought, we hope Mark will find a suitable role for his sister within the company. A suitable role, not a thank you, not an acknowledgement, not even a token inheritance. Just a footnote, a charitable recommendation to the new king. My 38 years of life, my entire professional existence, reduced to a postscript in my brother's story. They didn't know, or maybe they did, and they just didn't care. They didn't know that for the last 3 grueling years, I had been the one secretly, single-handedly, developing their new blockbuster drug, the one poised to save the company and secure the family name for a generation. They saw Mark, the face of the company. They never saw me, the brain, the ghost in their machine. And while they had been so careful to keep my name off the will, so meticulous in ensuring every last stock certificate went to their golden boy, they forgot one tiny little detail. They forgot to take my name off the international patent I had filed 6 months ago. It was an oversight that was about to cost them everything. The drive back from the lawyer's office is a blur of rain-slicked streets, and the rhythmic thump of the windshield wipers, each sweep a futile attempt to clear my vision. I didn't go home. Not to my small, meticulously clean apartment that always felt more like a laboratory than a living space. Instead, I found myself pulling into a deserted scenic overlook, a place where teenagers usually came to park on summer nights. The sky was the color of a fresh bruise, a churning mess of gray and purple that matched the storm inside me. For a moment, I just sat there, the engine ticking as it cooled, my hands still clenched on the steering wheel. Then the first sob broke free. It wasn't a delicate cinematic cry. It was a raw, ugly, guttural sound that seemed to be ripped from the deepest part of my soul. The silence of the lawyer's office had been a dam, holding back a 30-year flood of slights, dismissals, and quiet heartbreaks. Now, in the lonely shelter of my car, the dam didn't just break, it detonated. I wept for the little girl who aced her science fairs, only to have her parents miss the award ceremony because Mark had a soccer game. I wept for the teenager who got a full academic scholarship to a prestigious university, an achievement that was celebrated with a polite, distracted dinner, while Mark's acceptance into a mid-tier state school on a partial athletic scholarship was marked with a week-long celebration and a new car. And I wept for the woman I was now, the scientist who had poured her life's work into a vial, a clear, unassuming liquid that held the power to change the world, only to have it treated like a clever hobby. The drug, which I had provisionally named Vance Prolev, was a novel neurostabilizer. It didn't just treat the symptoms of early-onset Alzheimer's. In early trials, it had shown the potential to halt, and in some cases even reverse the cognitive decline. It was the kind of discovery that wins Nobel Prizes. It was revolutionary, and to my family it was just content. A product for Mark to sell. I leaned my forehead against the cold glass of the driver's side window, the rain streaking down like tears on the other side. The memories came, unbidden and sharp. I remembered the late nights, not in some gleaming Vance biopharma facility, but in the cramped, borrowed space of my university's research lab. I was an adjunct professor, a position that gave me access to the equipment I needed, but paid me a pittance. I'd told my department head I was working on a speculative personal project. It wasn't entirely a lie. It was personal. It was just also meant to be the salvation of my family's company, a company that was, I now knew, never meant to be mine. I'd sleep on a cot in my office, surrounded by the hum of centrifuges and the acrid smell of ozone, my only company, the flickering screens of data. I lived on vending machine coffee, and the fierce, burning hope that this work would finally make them see me. What a fool I'd been. My mind flashed back to a family dinner, about a year ago. It was for my mother's birthday. We were at their house in La Jolla, a sprawling Spanish-style mansion overlooking the Pacific. The air was thick with the scent of salt and night-blooming jasmine, and the table was laden with my mother Eleanor's famous seafood paella, a dish she only made for the most special of occasions. Mark, of course, was holding court. He'd just been promoted to vice president of sales, a title our father Richard had invented for him. He was telling a story about closing a deal with a chain of clinics in the Midwest, embellishing every detail, making it sound like he'd single-handedly negotiated world peace. My parents hung on his every word, their faces glowing with pride. At a lull in the conversation, I tried to share my own news. I had a breakthrough this week, I said, my voice feeling small in the vast open-air dining room. The compound is stabilizing. The in vitro results on the amyloid plaque degradation are, well, they're unprecedented. My father nodded slowly, a spoonful of paella, halfway to his mouth. That's nice, dear. Good work. He didn't ask for details. He didn't ask what it meant. His eyes were already shifting back to my brother. My mother, Eleanor, patted my hand, her touch as light and dismissive as a butterfly. We're so proud of all your little projects, Sarah. It's wonderful you have a hobby you're so passionate about. A hobby, 3 years of relentless, world-class biochemical research. A hobby, I remember looking at the saffron-stained rice on my plate, a knot tightening in my stomach. It wasn't about revenge then. It was just a deep, hollow ache, the familiar pain of being fundamentally misunderstood by the people who were supposed to know you best. I was the family's quiet, reliable, invisible daughter, the background radiation to Mark's shining star. The most painful memory, however, was the one that sealed my fate. It was 6 months before they passed, when I finally had the stable compound and the conclusive data. I'd driven to their house, my hands shaking, holding a binder thick with charts, graphs, and molecular diagrams. I sat with my father in his study, the same room where his will would later be read. The air smelled of his cigars and smug satisfaction. I walked him through it, slide by slide. I explained the mechanism of action, the way Vance Prolev targeted and dismantled the tau protein tangles that choked the life from neurons. For the first time, I saw a flicker of genuine comprehension in his eyes. He wasn't a scientist, but he was a businessman. He understood numbers, and the numbers I was showing him were staggering. He saw the dollar signs. He saw the legacy. "My God, Sarah," he'd said, leaning back in his chair. The pride in his voice was intoxicating. I felt a lifetime of seeking his approval crest into a wave of triumphant relief. For one shining moment, I thought, this is it. This is when everything changes. But then his expression shifted. The pride was replaced by a shrewd, calculating look. "This is incredible," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "But we have to be smart about this. We need to keep this completely under wraps. Your name, your involvement, it complicates things. Investors want a simple story, a family legacy." He stood up and paced the room. "Mark will be the face of this. He knows how to sell. He'll present it. We'll say it's a culmination of my life's work, a project I'd been overseeing for years. It's for the good of the family, Sarah. For the business." He made it sound so reasonable, so logical, a strategic decision. And I, desperate for his approval, desperate to be a part of the family, in a meaningful way, I agreed. I let him absorb my work, my discovery, into his narrative. I became a ghostwriter for my own life's achievement. He promised they would make it right for me when the drug went to market. A bonus, a promotion. I see now that his promises were as empty as his understanding of my science. The insistent buzz of my phone against the car's center console dragged me back to the present. I glanced at the screen. Mark Vance. A missed call, then another, and a text message. I swiped it open, my hands no longer shaking, but steady with a cold, clear anger. The message read, "Hey sis. Hope you're okay. Today was tough. Listen, I have a big preliminary meeting with the board and some potential investors on Friday. I need you to pull together all your notes on that Alzheimer's thing. Dad said you had it all organized. Need it ASAP. No condolences. No acknowledgement of the will. Just a demand. An assumption. The same casual, entitled appropriation of my work that had defined my entire life." I stared at the message, the words blurring through the fresh tears welling in my eyes. And then another message pinged through, right below the first one. "Sarah, don't be difficult. Dad said you'd help. This is my company now. You need to be a team player." Team player. The phrase hit me like a physical blow. I had been the most valuable player on a team that refused to even give me a jersey. I had built the stadium, invented the ball, and written the rulebook for the game they were about to play, and they had relegated me to the role of water girl. Something inside me snapped. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was a quiet, definitive click, like a switch being flipped in a dark room. The grief, the hurt, the decades of quiet resentment, they didn't disappear. They transmuted. They cooled and hardened into something else. Something solid and sharp. Resolve. I took a deep, shuddering breath and wiped my eyes with the back of my hand. The rain had started to let up, and a sliver of pale, watery light was breaking through the clouds. I looked at Mark's texts one more time. "This is my company now." No, I thought, the words forming with crystalline clarity in my mind. It's not. It wasn't about revenge. Not yet. At that moment, it was about correction. It was about balancing an equation that had been wrong for a very, very long time. I started the car, the engine humming to life with a reassuring thrum. I didn't drive home. I drove towards the city, towards the one person I knew would understand. The one person who would see this not as a family squabble, but as a declaration of war. I picked up my phone, my fingers flying across the screen, not to reply to my brother, but to send a message of my own. "Lena, are you free? I need to see you. Something's happened." The reply came back in less than a minute. "Always." Name the place. I suggested a small, quiet cafe in North Park, far from the polished seaside haunts my family frequented. It was the kind of place with mismatched furniture and art, from local students on the walls, a place where no one would know the name Vance. I needed that anonymity. I needed a space that was mine. Dr. Lena Petrova was already there when I arrived, tucked into a corner booth with 2 steaming mugs already on the table. She was my opposite in so many ways. Where I was quiet and reserved, Lena was vibrantly, unapologetically present. With her sharp, intelligent eyes and a cascade of dark, unruly hair, she was constantly trying to tame. She radiated an energy that was both fiercely protective and deeply cynical. We had met in grad school, bonding over a shared nemesis of a professor and a mutual love for elegant, efficient experimental design. She was the only person in my life who saw my work for what it was, and my family for what they were. She took one look at my face, and her expression softened from its usual wry irony into genuine concern. "Sarah, you look like you've been through a war." "The will was read today," I said, my voice hoarse. I slid into the booth opposite her, wrapping my cold hands around the warm ceramic mug. "Ah," she said, her tone laden with a weary understanding. "Let me guess. The princeling gets the kingdom, and the court scientist gets a pat on the head, and a thank you for your services plaque." "Worse," I said. And I told her. I told her everything. The exact wording in the will. Mark's smug, patronizing offer of a suitable roles. His text messages demanding my notes. As I spoke, the clinical detachment I usually hid behind crumbled, and the raw emotion of the past few hours poured out. Lena just listened, her gaze never leaving mine. She didn't offer platitudes or empty comforts. She just let me empty the poison. When I was finished, a heavy silence hung between us. Lena took a slow sip of her coffee. "They're not just dismissive, Sarah," she said, finally, her voice low and tight with anger on my behalf. "They're thieves. They're standing on top of a mountain you built, and calling themselves kings." She paused, leaning forward. "So, what are you going to do about it?" My hand trembled as I reached into my bag. I pulled out a folded sheaf of papers and pushed it across the table. It was a printed copy of the patent application I'd filed with the World Intellectual Property Organization. "This," I said, simply. Lena picked it up, her brow furrowed in concentration as she read. I watched her eyes scan the technical jargon, the chemical formulas, the dense legal text. Then they stopped. They widened, and a slow, dangerous smile spread across her face. It was the smile of a scientist who has just seen a fatal flaw in a rival's theory. "Oh, you beautiful, clever, devious woman," she breathed, looking up at me. "You're not just listed as an inventor. You're the primary inventor." I nodded, a small tentative smile touching my own lips for the first time that day. My father saw it as a formality, a way to appease me. He never read the fine print. He just wanted to get the application filed to secure the international rights before a big investor conference. "And let me guess," Lena continued, her mind already racing ahead, piecing it together. "This isn't a company patent filed by Vance Biopharma. You filed it as a private individual, with the company as a co-applicant." "I had to," I explained. "The university has a stake in any research done using their facilities, but they have a clause that allows for independent patenting if the primary research and, crucially, the filing fees are paid for by the individual." I drained my savings account to pay for it. I told my father it was the fastest way, a bureaucratic shortcut. He just saw it as me taking initiative. He didn't realize I was building a firewall. Lena let out a low whistle. "Sarah, he didn't see it because he fundamentally doesn't respect you. His arrogance was your opportunity. This document, this isn't just leverage. This is a weapon of mass destruction." The weight in my chest seemed to lighten, just a fraction. Hearing it from her, hearing my own secret strategy validated, made it feel real. It wasn't just a fantasy of revenge I'd cooked up in a fit of grief. It was a viable, legal, and exquisitely precise plan. We talked for another hour, our conversation shifting from the emotional fallout to cold, hard strategy. It was during this time that Lena shared her own battle. A senior tenured professor in her department, a man with a colossal ego and dwindling original ideas, had been systematically trying to elbow his way onto her latest research paper. He was claiming her work on gene editing therapies was merely an extension of his earlier, much less successful, theories. "He's trying to mentor me," she said, her voice dripping with scorn, which is academic code for he wants to slap his name on my paper as senior author and present it at the Zurich Symposium as his own. "It's the same disease, Sarah, a different strain but the same pathology, entitlement. The belief that our work is a resource for them to exploit." Her struggle, so parallel to mine, forged a new kind of bond between us. We weren't just friends anymore. We were allies. Her fight fueled my resolve, and mine, hers. It was a relief to know I wasn't alone in this particular kind of quiet professional warfare. "You can't do this halfway," Lena said, her tone firm. "You can't just use this to negotiate for a better role. They'll placate you, tie you up in legal knots, and find a way to cut you out later. You have to go for the throat." "What does that look like?" I asked, the question hanging in the air. "It looks like a lawyer," she said, immediately. "Not Abernathy, not anyone connected to your family. You need a shark, someone who specializes in intellectual property and corporate litigation, someone who eats men like your father and brother for breakfast." She pulled out her phone. "I know a woman, Evelyn Reed. She helped a friend of mine sue a tech giant for patent infringement and won. They called her the surgeon because her legal arguments are so precise, they leave no room for doubt." The idea of bringing in a lawyer, a stranger, made my stomach clench. It made everything feel so final, so aggressive. A part of me, the part that had been conditioned for decades to be the good, quiet daughter, recoiled. But then I thought of Mark's text message. "Be a team player." I thought of my mother calling my life's work a hobby. The clenching in my stomach was replaced by a cold fire. "Make the call," I said. The next day I was sitting in the starkly modern glass and steel office of Evelyn Reed. She was the opposite of Mr. Abernathy in every conceivable way. Dressed in a sharply tailored gray suit, with her silver hair cut in a severe geometric bob, she exuded an aura of intimidating competence. There was no family history here, no sentimental clutter, just a desk, 2 chairs, and a panoramic view of the city. I laid out the story for her, just as I had for Lena, but this time it was different. I was more composed, more factual. I presented the binder of my research, the digital logs from the university lab, my bank statements showing the wire transfers for the patent filing fees, and the printout of the international patent application itself. Miss Reed listened without interruption, her steepled fingers resting on her chin, her eyes scanning each document I placed before her. When I finished, she didn't offer sympathy, she offered a diagnosis. "Your father made a classic arrogant mistake, Dr. Vance," she said, her voice crisp. "He conflated ownership of the company with ownership of your intellect. In the eyes of patent law, especially under the Patent Cooperation Treaty, the inventor holds significant, inalienable rights. Your name on that document as primary inventor is the legal foundation of everything." She stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the city below. "The patent not only covers the compound Vance Prolev, but also, as you've cleverly specified, the proprietary synthesis method. This is the crucial part. Without your explicit cooperation and knowledge transfer, they can't replicate the manufacturing process at scale. They have the recipe, but you have the cooking instructions, and those instructions are locked in your head and in your personal lab notes." She turned back to me, a glint in her eye. "But there's more. You insisted on a clause requiring the consent of all named inventors for any licensing or manufacturing agreements. Your father likely saw it as boilerplate, a meaningless bit of legalese to keep you happy. In reality, you gave yourself a veto." a complete and total veto over the single most valuable asset your family's company possesses. A wave of relief so profound it almost made me dizzy washed over me. It was real. The firewall I had so desperately and secretly built was not only standing, it was impenetrable. "So what's our first move?" I asked, my voice gaining strength. "Our first move is silence," Miss Reed said. "You will not respond to your brother. You will not respond to any family members or their representatives. You are a black box. Let his panic build. Let him wonder what you're doing. Desperate people make mistakes." She paused, a thin smile on her lips. "Your brother strikes me as the type who will get desperate very, very quickly." Her second piece of advice was to create what she called a fortress of evidence. Over the next week, I became a digital archivist of my own life. I scanned every page of my physical lab notebooks. I collated every email exchange with my father, highlighting the parts where he acknowledged my progress and urged me to keep it secret. I created a meticulous timeline, cross-referencing my lab work with company announcements and my father's calendar. It was a grim, painful process, like performing an autopsy on my own family relationships, but with each document I saved to the encrypted drive Miss Reed had given me, I felt my position solidify. I was no longer just the wronged daughter. I was a plaintiff building an airtight case. The narrative was no longer theirs to control. It was mine. The silence worked exactly as Miss Reed predicted. For the first 2 days, Mark's messages were tinged with a sort of brotherly annoyance. "Sarah, come on. I need those notes. Don't be petty." Then, as the Friday investor meeting loomed, the tone shifted, the charm evaporated, replaced by a raw, exposed panic. The texts became a barrage of pleas, threats, and emotional manipulations. "I can't believe you're doing this to me." To the family, "Dad would be turning in his grave. He trusted you." "The board is asking questions. You're making me look like an idiot. Just pick up the phone. For God's sake. We can work this out." I followed Miss Reed's instructions to the letter. I read every message, every desperate plea, and I felt nothing. It was like watching a storm from behind a thick pane of glass. The wind was howling, the rain was lashing against the window, but inside I was calm, dry, and perfectly still. The emotional hooks he was casting out so desperately had nothing to latch onto anymore. I had systematically removed them, one by one. The call from Mr. Abernathy came on Thursday afternoon, the day before Mark's big meeting. His voice was flustered, shedding its usual placid professional tone. "Sarah, my dear, I've been trying to reach you. Mark is very concerned. There seems to be some misunderstanding about the research materials for Vance Prolev." I let the silence hang for a moment, before replying, my voice even and cool. "There is no misunderstanding, Arthur. If you or your client, Mr. Mark Vance, have any professional inquiries, you may direct them to my legal counsel, Evelyn Reed. I have her card. I can have her send it to you." There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. The family lawyer, the man who had patted my head as a child, was being stonewalled. He was out of his depth, and he knew it. "Your legal counsel," he stammered. "That's correct," I said, and with a polite but firm, "I have to go now, Arthur." I ended the call. That, Miss Reed later told me, was the moment they knew this was not a family tiff. This was a hostile engagement. The Friday of the investor meeting came and went. I spent the day at the university library, losing myself in journals about cellular biology, feeling the familiar comfort of data and discovery. That evening, Miss Reed called me. "He did it," she said, and I could hear the satisfaction in her voice. He blinked. "What did he do?" I asked. "He filed a petition with the patent office to have your name removed from the application, claiming it was a clerical errors in the original filing." My heart skipped a beat. "Can he do that?" "He can certainly try," Miss Reed said, and I could practically hear her smiling. "And in doing so, he has just handed us a gift-wrapped felony. Attempting to fraudulently alter a patent filing is a very serious offense. He's moved from a corporate dispute into the realm of criminal liability. He's no longer just an incompetent CEO. He's a clumsy crook, and we have the paperwork to prove it. It was at that moment I truly understood the shift that had occurred. It wasn't about revenge, until it was. Mark, in his arrogance and desperation, had escalated this beyond a fight for credit or compensation. He had tried to erase me. He had tried to retroactively steal my identity and my life's work, and in doing so, he had given me all the ammunition I would ever need. The quiet, methodical takeover had begun. It was time for my first real move. The first shot was not a cannonball, but a silent, perfectly aimed sniper round. On Monday morning, following Miss Reed's precise timetable, a courier delivered a sleek, deceptively thin envelope to the gleaming headquarters of Vance Biopharma. It was addressed not to my brother Mark, but to the entire board of directors, care of the chairman. Inside was not an emotional plea or an angry letter, but a formal cease and desist notice, drafted by Miss Reed on her intimidatingly minimalist letterhead. The letter was a masterpiece of legal restraint and veiled threat. It calmly and factually stated that Dr. Sarah Vance was the primary inventor of the compound known as Vance Prolev and its proprietary synthesis method, as documented in International Patent Application 02023-12345. It went on to state that any and all attempts to manufacture, license, market, or enter into financial agreements concerning this intellectual property, without the express, written consent of the primary inventor, would constitute willful patent infringement, subject to the highest possible legal and financial penalties in every jurisdiction covered by the treaty. It made no demands. It offered no room for negotiation. It was a simple, elegant, and brutal declaration of fact. It was a wall, dropped from the sky, directly in their path. I didn't have to imagine the chaos that letter would cause. I heard about it, in fragments, from Lena, whose network of contacts in the local biotech community was extensive. The news spread like a virus. The sure thing, the miracle drug that was meant to be the glorious next chapter of the Vance legacy, was now legally radioactive. The investors Mark had been courting, the ones he'd tried to impress with his hollow sales pitch, vanished. They didn't just get cold feet, they sprinted for the exits. The whispers started immediately. Why was the company's core asset not actually owned by the company? Who was this mysterious sister, and why did she hold all the power? The share price of Vance Biopharma, which had been steadily climbing on the hype Mark had been so desperately building, didn't just wobble, it plummeted. In a single day, the company lost nearly 30% of its value. My father's legacy, the thing my brother claimed to be protecting, was evaporating in real time, a direct consequence of their own greed and dismissal. Mark's reaction was, predictably, nuclear. The barrage of calls and texts I had received before now seemed like a polite inquiry. This was a digital siege. He left voicemails that were a terrifying cocktail of rage, pleading and disbelief. "Sarah, what have you done? You're destroying the company. Call me back right now." Then an hour later, a message that was dripping with a desperate, fraudulent sweetness. "Hey sis. Okay, I get it. You're upset about the will. I am too. It wasn't fair. Let's talk. We can fix this. I'll give you a piece of my shares. Whatever you want, just call off your lawyer." Then back to fury. "Do you have any idea what you've done? The board is in an uproar. You've made me a laughingstock. This is all your fault. After everything Mom and Dad did for you." I listened to them once, dispassionately, as if studying the vocalizations of a distressed lab animal. Then I saved them to the evidence folder, and blocked his number. The silence that followed was more powerful than any argument I could ever have made. The board, however, was a different story. These were not emotional family members. They were seasoned business people. They were sharks who smelled blood in the water, and they realized the blood was coming from their own CEO. Miss Reed started receiving calls. Not from Mark, but from two of the senior board members, a man named George Peterson and a woman named Clara Bellwether. They had been on the board for decades, appointed by my grandfather. Their loyalty was to the business, not to the family soap opera. They didn't try to threaten or cajole, Miss Reed told me, after her first conference call with them. They were professional. They wanted to know the situation. They wanted to know if there was a path forward. I told them that any path forward would have to go through you, and that my client was currently assessing all of her options. She paused, and I could hear the faint sound of her tapping a pen on her desk. They're not on Mark's side, Sarah. They're on the side of their investment. They see him for what he is, a liability, an empty suit, who has just piloted their flagship into an iceberg. In their eyes, you've gone from being the problem to being the only possible solution. It was a strange feeling, being seen as a solution by the very people who a month ago wouldn't have known my name. My father had built a board of shrewd, unsentimental operators, and in his arrogance, he never imagined that their lack of sentimentality would one day work against his own son. Mark, feeling his power base within the company crumble, fell back on the only tactic he had left: raw, undiluted emotional manipulation. The final escalation came not as a text or a call, but as a loud, insistent banging on my apartment door late one evening. I looked through the peephole. It was him. His hair was a mess. His expensive suit was rumpled, and his handsome face was blotchy with stress and fury. I almost didn't open it. My first instinct was to hide, to pretend I wasn't there. But then I remembered Miss Reed's words. You are a black box. A black box doesn't hide. It simply exists. Impervious. I took a breath, smoothed down my simple cotton sweater, and opened the door. He looked shocked that I had opened it, as if he had expected to have to break it down. For a moment he just stood there, speechless. Mark, I said, my voice level. I didn't invite him in. I stood in the doorway, a human barrier. Sarah, he began, trying to summon his old charm, but it came out cracked and weak. We need to talk. I don't think we do, I replied calmly. I've referred all professional inquiries to my lawyer. This isn't professional. This is family. He burst out, his voice rising. What you're doing is insane. You're burning everything to the ground. Mom and Dad's legacy. Their legacy. I interrupted, and my voice was still quiet, but it had an edge of steel I'd never used with him before. Their legacy was a thriving biopharmaceutical company, built on cutting-edge science. You're the one who is turning it into a punchline, by trying to run it without any understanding of what it actually does. The science was my contribution. A contribution they chose to ignore, and you chose to steal. You can't have the rewards of my work without acknowledging me, Mark. That's not how the world works. His face contorted with a frustration so pure, it was almost pitiable. He was a man who had talked his way through his entire life, and for the first time, his words were having no effect. It was like he was yelling at a mountain. Mom would be horrified, he whispered, his eyes welling up with what looked like genuine tears. It was his trump card. The one he'd always used. Invoking our mother. She would want us to stick together, to support each other. The memory of my mother patting my hand and calling my life's work a hobby flashed in my mind, the memory of her fawning over Mark's meaningless sales awards while I was quietly changing the face of medicine in a lonely lab. The tears in his eyes didn't move me. They enraged me. Don't you dare, I said, my voice dropping to a near whisper, but it was more menacing than any shout. Don't you dare use her memory to manipulate me. You have no idea what she would have wanted. You never saw me, Mark. None of you did. You saw a convenient, quiet resource, a utility. Well, the utility has been shut off. He stared at me, his mouth slightly agape. The charming salesman was gone. The golden child was gone. All that was left was a confused, frightened man who had just realized the game was rigged, but not in his favor. He was seeing me, really seeing me, for the very first time, and he was terrified. "This company is all we have left of them," he said, his last desperate plea. "No," I replied, the finality of the word hanging in the air between us. "You have the house, you have the stocks, you have the money, you have everything they wanted you to have, but the science, the future, that was always mine." And with that, I gently but firmly closed the door in his face. I leaned my back against it, listening to his footsteps retreat down the hall. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated. I just felt quiet. The storm had passed over. The power had shifted. The silent takeover was nearly complete. The exodus began subtly. It wasn't a mass resignation, but a quiet, strategic realignment of loyalties. The first to jump ship was Clara Bellwether, the most pragmatic member of the Vance Biopharma board. She arranged a meeting with me and Miss Reed at a neutral location, a discreet private dining room in a downtown hotel. There was no pretense, no emotional appeal. It was pure business. "Dr. Vance," she began, her gaze direct and assessing, "my colleagues and I find ourselves in an untenable position. We have a CEO who is, to put it mildly, not equipped for the role, and our company's single most valuable asset is controlled by an external party." She gestured towards me. "You." I let Miss Reed do most of the talking, but I watched Clara's face intently. I saw a professional who had dedicated years to building something, only to watch an unqualified heir threaten to demolish it. In a strange way, we were on the same side. We both wanted to save the work. "We understand your position," Clara continued, "and frankly, from a legal and ethical standpoint, it is unassailable. My question is this: what is your end game? Do you intend to license the patent to a competitor, or do you have a plan for Vance Biopharma?" This was the moment, the opening I had been waiting for. I leaned forward, placing my hands on the table. "Vance Biopharma, as it is currently structured and led, is not a viable partner for me," I said, my voice steady. "It is saddled with my brother's incompetence, and now his potential legal troubles regarding the fraudulent patent filing. It carries the weight of a family narrative that I no longer wish to be a part of." Clara nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. "So what do you propose?" "I am not interested in destroying my father's legacy," I said, choosing my words carefully. "I am interested in fulfilling its true potential. The science, my science, deserves a home. A company built around innovation, not just marketing. A company led by vision, not by nepotism." The implication hung in the air, as clear as the crystal water glasses on the table. The days that followed were a blur of encrypted emails and discreet phone calls, orchestrated by Miss Reed. The board was fracturing. George Peterson, the other senior member, quickly fell in line with Clara. Two others followed. They saw Mark not as their leader, but as the primary obstacle to their own financial survival. They were tired of the drama, the plummeting stock, the public embarrassment. They wanted a life raft, and I was the only one with a boat. Mark, isolated and increasingly powerless, made one last desperate attempt at counter-manipulation. He couldn't reach me, so he tried to go around me. He launched a pathetic one-man smear campaign within the dregs of the company still loyal to him. The narrative he spun was that of the bitter, jealous sister, a failed academic who was trying to sabotage her successful brother out of pure spite. He told people I was unstable, that my contributions to the drug were minimal and exaggerated, and that I was being manipulated by an aggressive lawyer. It was a feeble, transparent tactic, and it backfired spectacularly. The more he railed against me, the more unhinged and incompetent he appeared to the very people he needed to convince. He was no longer the charming salesman. He was a cornered animal lashing out blindly. His attempts to paint me as the villain only served to illuminate his own profound inadequacy. He had no grasp of the science, no new strategy, no vision for the future. All he had was a story about how unfair it all was, a narrative that was wearing thinner by the day, The final act of his desperation was the most pathetic of all. He tried to rally the extended family, aunts, uncles, cousins, who I hadn't spoken to in years. He called them, feeding them his twisted version of the story, hoping to create a wave of familial pressure that would force me to back down. I received a few awkward, guilt-ridden phone calls. An aunt who told me, "Your father would have wanted peace in the family." A cousin who mumbled something about how Mark was having a tough time, and that I should be the bigger person. I handled each call with the same calm, polite detachment. "Thank you for your concern," I would say. "This is a legal matter between myself and the board of Vance Biopharma. It's being handled by our respective attorneys." I was shutting down the emotional battlefield he was trying so desperately to create. I refused to engage in the family drama, the guilt-tripping, the whispered accusations. I was a scientist. I dealt in facts, and the facts were all on my side. The power shift was complete. He was left shouting into a void, while I was quietly negotiating the terms of his surrender with the people who actually mattered. The family that had defined my life was becoming irrelevant. I was building a new one, based not on blood, but on mutual respect and a shared vision. The confrontation, when it finally came, was not the shouting match I had once envisioned. It was something far colder, far more devastating. It took place in the main conference room at Vance Biopharma, a room I had never been invited into before. The long, polished table reflected the strained faces of the board members. Mark sat at the head of the table, a king presiding over a crumbling kingdom. He was trying to project an air of authority, but the tremor in his hand as he adjusted his tie gave him away. I walked in with Miss Reed by my side. I was wearing a simple dark blue dress. I felt a strange sense of calm. The fear was gone. The anger had cooled into a focused, quiet energy. I took a seat not at the far end of the table, as a visitor might, but in the middle, directly opposite Mark. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second. I saw a flicker of his old smug defiance, but it was quickly extinguished by a wave of raw fear. He knew. Mark cleared his throat and began, his voice straining to sound commanding. "Thank you for coming. I've called this meeting to address the internal disagreements that have been causing some unfortunate market instability. I want to assure the board that this is a family matter, and, with all due respect, Mark," I said, my voice cutting cleanly through his bluster, "this is not a family matter. This is a corporate governance and intellectual property crisis." I nodded to Miss Reed, who placed a slim laptop on the table and connected it to the room's large display screen. What followed was not an argument. It was a presentation, a lecture. For 20 minutes, I took the board of directors and my brother on a guided tour of my life's work. The first slide was a timeline. It showed the date I began my research, cross-referenced with the company's quarterly reports, which showed declining revenues and a pipeline of failed drugs. I showed them the emails from my father, his words praising my progress, while simultaneously demanding my silence, glowing on the screen for all to see. I walked them through the science, simplifying the complex biochemistry into a language that even a salesman could understand. I showed them the molecular structure of Vance Prolov, the data from the in vitro trials, the mechanism that made it a billion-dollar discovery. I owned the information. It flowed from me with an easy authority that left no room for doubt. Then came the final slides. A copy of the international patent, with my name clearly listed as primary inventor. A copy of the clause giving me absolute veto power. And finally a copy of the fraudulent petition Mark had filed to have my name removed. A collective gasp went through the room. I saw board members physically recoil from my brother. His face had gone from pale to a ghastly shade of gray. I turned off the projector, and the room was plunged into a thick, profound silence. I let it hang there for a beat, then I spoke, my voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. "Vance Biopharma, as an entity, has a choice," I said, looking not at Mark, but at Clara Bellwether and George Peterson. It can remain tethered to a CEO who has no understanding of its core science, who has alienated its chief innovator, and who has exposed this company to massive legal and financial risk through his fraudulent actions. Or it can choose a new path. I slid a single folder across the table, towards Clara. Inside that folder is my proposal. I will not license my patent to Vance Biopharma. The brand is damaged, and its leadership is compromised. However, I am in the process of founding a new entity, a lean science-focused company called Pralev Science. I will be its CEO. My new company will hold the exclusive license to the Vance Pralev patent and all its derivatives. I paused, letting the words sink in. My offer to the board is this: a motion to dissolve Vance Biopharma. Its viable assets can be absorbed, and its shareholders will be offered a 1-to-1 share exchange in Pralev Science. You can cut your losses and invest in a future built on real innovation, or you can go down with a ship being captained by a man who thinks a sales slogan is a substitute for a scientific breakthrough. Mark finally found his voice. It was a strangled, pathetic sound. You can't do this. This is my father's company. No, Mark, I said, turning to him at last, my gaze unwavering. It was his company, but the future was and is my science. Clara Bellwether opened the folder. She read the single page inside, then looked up, her eyes meeting mine. She nodded, a slow, deliberate gesture of assent. Then she looked at Mark, her expression one of utter contempt. I move for a vote of no confidence in our current CEO, she said, her voice like ice. Seconded, George Peterson said immediately. It was a slaughter. One by one, they voted him out. He was stripped of his title, his power, his entire identity, in less than 5 minutes. He just sat there, utterly broken, as the architecture of his life was dismantled around him. The new reality settled over him like a shroud. He looked at me, his eyes hollow with the devastating clarity of complete and total defeat. For the first time in his life, he was the one who was invisible. The charade was finally truly over. It has been 6 months since that day in the conference room. I am writing this from my new office. It's not as large or ornate as my father's was, but it's mine. The walls are glass, and from my desk I can look out over the entire laboratory floor, where a team of brilliant, dedicated scientists are hard at work refining the next phase of clinical trials for Pralev. The view isn't of the ocean, but of progress. The quiet, focused hum of discovery is the only soundtrack I need. Pralev Science is thriving. We secured a new round of funding last month that exceeded all expectations. The market, it turns out, loves a good story. And the story of a company, actually being led by the scientist who created its core product, is a very good story indeed. Lena's subplot in this drama also reached a satisfying conclusion. Inspired by my battle, she refused to be bullied by the senior professor at her university. She meticulously documented his attempts to claim her work, gathered support from other faculty members who he had wronged in the past, and presented her case to the dean. The professor was censured, removed from the Zurich symposium, and is now facing a formal inquiry. We celebrated our respective victories with a bottle of ridiculously expensive champagne at that same little cafe in North Park, toasting to what Lena called the glorious and long overdue triumph of the nerds. It felt good to have an ally, a sister in arms. As for Mark, I hear things. Whispers on the periphery. The La Jolla mansion had to be sold to cover the mountain of debt Vance Biopharma had accumulated under his and my father's business-first stewardship. The company was formally dissolved, its name and legacy vanishing into a footnote in a legal document. I heard from a cousin that Mark is now selling high-end life insurance policies. He's back to doing what he does best, selling promises of a future he can't guarantee. He never contacted me again. I imagine my name is a curse in what's left of his world. And now I have to ask myself the questions that you're probably thinking. Do I feel guilty? Did I go too far? Did I destroy my family to get what I wanted? These questions circle in my mind on quiet nights. It wasn't about the money or the title. I know that in my bones, it was about respect. It was about the fundamental right to be acknowledged for your own work, your own contribution. It was about reclaiming a narrative that had been stolen from me before I was old enough to know how to write it. Some might say I destroyed my family's legacy. But the truth is, a legacy built on a lie isn't a legacy at all, it's a liability. My parents built a house of cards on a foundation of my silent work, and my brother thought he could live in it forever. I didn't burn the house down, I just gently, calmly and methodically removed the card at the very bottom that was holding the whole thing up. My card. My story is about finding your own value, when the people who are supposed to see it most, refuse to. It's about realizing that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stop waiting for an invitation to a table where you're not wanted, and go build your own. It's about taking your name off their will, and putting it on your own future. What would you have done in my shoes? Is there a point where loyalty to your family becomes disloyalty to yourself? I'm genuinely curious to know what you think. Let me know your story in the comments below. I'll be reading them. And if you found some value in my story, and you want to hear more tales of injustice and vindication, please click that like button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for listening.